Well, good evening, everyone. And I want to thank you all for joining us. I'm Michael Tomasky, as Kim just said, and I am the editor of the New Republic. And tonight we're going to be talking about crime, criminal justice, mass incarceration, the potential for reform in any or all of those fields. And I'm very excited to be having this conversation. And it's built off of a feature article, an excellent feature article that we ran in our last issue by Mr. John Pfaff. And there's Mr. John Pfaff right there. And he is a law professor at Fordham University, and he is the author of the 2017 book, Locked In, The True Causes of Mass Incarceration and How to Achieve Real Reform. That was a 2017 book he wrote. His TNR piece, which ran in the July-August issue and is available for your reading at TNR.com, is Can Criminal Justice Reform Survive a Wave of Violent Crime? And we're joined also by Amy Fettig. Amy is the executive director of the Sentencing Project and a leading expert on criminal justice. She's been at the Sentencing Project for just about a year. Prior to joining the Sentencing Project, she was deputy director for the ACLU's National Prison Project. So Amy, welcome to you as well. We hope and expect to be joined any minute here by Phillip Atiba Goff. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce him as if he were here, and he'll show up eventually. Phillip Atiba Goff is the co-founder and CEO of the Center for Policing Equity and a professor of African American Studies and Psychology at Yale University. So when he shows up, you'll already know what he's up to. Many of you may have seen him on MSNBC or CNN, where he started showing up a lot last year in the wake of the George Floyd murder. So hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. Let's start with John, since we're here to use your piece as a jumping off point for this conversation. John, will you just start out by describing the article that you wrote for TNR and what your point was and what it was about?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you, all of you, for coming tonight. The jumping off point for my article, obviously, is the undeniable spike in homicide that the United States experienced over, sort of the latter half of 2020 into 2021. Given how fractured and chaotic our data gathering system is, we don't really know the homicide numbers for 2020 for several more months, which is a whole separate issue. But we're looking at what is almost inarguably going to be the single biggest one-year jump in murder the United States has probably ever experienced, in order of, perhaps somewhere between 3,000 to 4,000 additional homicides versus the previous year. The previous biggest jump was at the peak of the crime boom in the early 90s at about 2,000, right? So this is a fairly unprecedented surge in homicide. I think it is worth noting, right, that most other violent crimes, perhaps unsurprisingly, fell as a general matter, right? Again, our data is messy, but the lockdowns made it hard to break into homes. It seems to have increased domestic violence, unsurprisingly, but other assaults and robberies seem to be down. But when people talk about violence, they're really talking about, homicide is first and foremost in their minds, right? There has been kind of this effort by some progressive to say, well, look, it's not violence, it's just homicide. But that just is, you can't really put a slide at just in before homicide, right? And so we're confronting this significant spike in homicide. That is undeniable, and you can't run from that. You shouldn't run from that. We have to lean into that fact. Where things get contentious is, what do we do about that, right? And unsurprisingly, after sort of this decade-long push for reform efforts, right, those who favor the more traditional, more tough on crime approach see this as an opportunity, right? This is their chance to strike back hard and aggressive reforms by trying to pin this homicide spike on reforms. And my point is that, one, that's just factually incorrect, right? That on the one hand, the reforms that we have in fact done are far more mild than the reforms that we claim have taken place. People attack San Antonio, I believe, for slashing their police budget, ignoring the fact that all the cuts were small and none of them were going to happen until 2021 anyway, right? So how could they trial homicides in 2020? They couldn't. But also the fact that homicide went up everywhere. It went up in New York City. It went up in Jacksonville, right? Which is one of the biggest deep red cities in America, right? And so this effort to argue that somehow progressive reforms caused the boom is simply wrong on the facts, right? Homicide went up the reforms aren't that large that we've done, especially when it comes to violence, right? And it went up everywhere. But that might not really matter, right? The politics of punishment aren't really tied to the actual nature of violence. They're tied to fear, right? To me, one of the most striking statistics out there is, there's this very popular statistic people tell about how even as crime was low and falling in the 2000s, something like 70% of all Americans said crime is going up. Proof that Americans had no idea what's going on. It's a lot more interesting than that. Over the course of the 1990s, as crime fell, more and more Americans said crime is going down, right? Every year Gallup asks, is crime higher? And over the 90s, as crime fell, fewer and fewer Americans said yes. We were learning. And in fact, in the year 2000, 2001, 60% of Americans said crime was going down. And for the first time since the early 1970s, state prison populations actually fell. We had learned, and the system had adapted. And in 2002, state prison populations jumped by about 30,000, and percent of Americans say crime is going up, even though it fell, jumped to about 75%. It had nothing to do with crime. And as far as I can tell, everything to do with 9/11. Yeah. We were terrified. In fact, interestingly, Gallup asks two questions. One, is crime up? And two, do you feel safe walking a mile away from your home at night? Is crime up? That jumped. Safe around your home? Barely budged. Right? We understood that our own neighborhoods were safe, but the world got scarier. And because the world got scarier, we had to get tougher on crime because that's how we respond to fear, right? And so the fact that crime went up everywhere, that this is not a progressive issue, it's a national issue that seems kind of untied to reform efforts, might not matter, right? Because the politics aren't tied to crime data, they're tied to fear. And fear is incredibly exploitable. And change that we're experiencing is an easy thing to villainize.
So why has crime gone up, do you think? I assume it's COVID related chiefly.
So it's fascinating, right? You see a growing effort by those who favor tough on crime to argue that COVID had nothing to do with this at all, to completely re-COVID, not to argue this fact was minor, to argue it was irrelevant. But they say, look, it's interesting. It's the same three countries in every article. Look at Canada, look at Mexico, look at El Salvador, right? Which is a high crime country, right? They didn't see a spike in homicide. Therefore, it can't be COVID because they would see it too. As if there's nothing else that separates Canada, Mexico, and El Salvador from us, right? Or they say, look, United States has always had a violent culture. So how could this change happen? Well, because it interacted with COVID, right? And so I think COVID played a huge role in this, right? And one that's going to be almost impossible in the long run to disentangle statistically because COVID affected everything, right? And so from a statistical point of view, it's a nightmare of a thing to behold, right? But clearly it played some significant role, right? And the reason why the tough on crime types are trying to just completely read COVID out of the picture is they want to blame the BLM protest, right? They want to say, look, the only thing that makes the United States different from Canada is that the United States had policing protests and Canada didn't. And so that's why homicide rose in the United States, right? And it's possible that the protest played a role. It'd be surprising if there's not some impact, but it's a really complicated one, right? Was it the protests themselves? Was it the impact of the way the police responded to the protests? I mean, we're going to talk about people who rioted, right? The police, they rioted a lot more than the protesters did, right? The protesters weren't randomly firing shots in the heads of reporters the way the police are firing beanbags at every reporter they could see and then calmly walking away. Slight overstatement, but not quite, right? And so, the protests might have mattered, but in ways that are incredibly complicated to disentangle, and many of which are going to reflect the underlying injustices that those protests were directed at, right? And so the protests surely contributed, the police response contributed, COVID is interwoven through all of this, right? And the collateral costs, the direct stress of COVID, right? Just the stress it imposed on all of us, the stress of lockdowns obviously contributed to domestic violence, the economic uncertainty that it imposed, right? There's not a lot of evidence necessarily that economic poverty leads to more crime, but economic uncertainty does, right? And uncertainty was vast. And again, the tough on crime response is, but see the CARES Act, right? It was a huge grant program, which it was, until you look at the recent Brookings report that points out that it was a mess, right? The dollar amount on that bottom line was huge, but it didn't make it to the most vulnerable in any period of time, right? Even months into this, so we're getting to June, July, August, half of the people who qualify for benefits had not yet received them, right? And the challenge you have with homicide, because homicide is so difficult, is homicide it's sticky, right? Once A shoots at B, Now B eventually is going to retaliate and shoot back at A and hit C, and C's friends are going to shoot back and hit D, and you get these webs of shooting. So you can't, homicide doesn't stop on a dime, right? It's not like you've got the stress of one thing, stress goes away, and homicide just stops. There's sort of a fallout that can take some time to work if you don't address it correctly, right? And so it's a complicated thing. COVID plays a role. The protests played a complicated role that's easy to overstate and oversimplify. But it's where we are. And so the question now is like, what do progressives do with this, right? My basic argument is you have to lean into this, right? Don't deny it. Don't pretend it didn't happen. Don't undersell it, but say, look, this happened on Tough on Crime's watch, right? Not much had changed and this homicide spike happens. They're saying, let's double down on a thing that basically didn't work, right? And unlike maybe the early 80s and late early 90s, we have a much better sense now of other things that can work to reduce violence that don't require a badge and a gun and that dangerous kind of interactions that always persist. And so I think, liberals, progressive reformers need to lean into this and not deny what's happening. We say this was Tough on Crime's responsibility, not reform's responsibility. And these are the things that we have, the positive things we have to offer that can actually make crime go down without the vast collateral human costs of policing that we don't measure, right? And the last thing I just want to state, just so people have this in mind, right? You're going to see a lot of cost benefit analyses of policing. And the best study, and it's a very good study by very good people, and I respect the work behind it, right? They say that $1 spent on policing cuts back about $1.60 in crime. But let's understand what that $1 cost is. That's the fiscal outlay for policing, right? The wages and the benefits and the cop cars and the fuel, that dollar. George Floyd's death isn't in that equation, right? The social and emotional cost of Black parents having to talk with their kids and the stress that means that every time their kid leaves their house, there's a little bit of their mind that's saying, I hope my kid comes home. That's not a cost in any of our cost benefit analyses, right? And it's important to think about that. Whatever the benefits policing have, they have huge negative spillover costs also that a lot of these other reforms don't, right? Maybe violence intervention doesn't have the same direct impact perhaps as policing, but it also doesn't kill people by mistake, right? And that's, I think, a huge missing part in this discussion is that our cost benefit analysis of all of this is just wrong and ignores the human cost in a very important kind of way.
Interesting. Dr. Goff, why don't you unmute yourself there, please, and join us. Let me just ask you what you think of what you just heard. I mean, what do you think the causes of the homicide spike are? And, do you think that this happened, as John suggests, on the watch of the Tough on Crime crowd?
So first, it was lovely to be here in the audience during the introduction. Lovely to see from that side. And I'm sure that the picture, the general picture was much prettier without me in the middle of it. It's hard to argue with John on the facts, and so I tend not to do that. I think that it's really important that we understand that folks who have sort of targeted particularly progressive prosecutors, because somehow progressive prosecutors have gotten a strange rap that they're all powerful at doing all things having to do with crime. They both write all of the laws and commit all of the crime, which if I knew that was a job, I would have signed up years ago. So it's absolutely the case that folks are saying, well, this is progressives and reforms have done this, and so we should push back against it. And that's not possible because all the things that they're saying have happened, haven't, and to the degree that there's data, the data just don't bear that out. But I'll also say that, perhaps a more controversial thing in this space and with this particular audience, the folks who have been trying to claim that, well, we know that reform doesn't work, I really wish we did. Now, that's not to say that the things that we've got targeted, we can't say, well, they haven't done enough and that they're not set up to do enough. Absolutely, we can say that. But the largest reforms that have been tried across, large cities are like to the tune of $75,000, $100,000 a year in the city. That's not a serious dosage of trying to get anything fixed. Right. So when we say that we've really folks have been trying to oversell reform, I can't overstate that enough. In terms of the causes of crime, I'll say definitively something that John won't say, because I know the answer, which is that we don't know. 1,000% we don't know. And it's a thing that's hard for scientists to learn to say. It's also a thing that's hard for folks to accept when their job is to come up with an opinion. Because it's very easy for a politician then to come in and weaponize it to say, we do know it's these sets of things that will cause you to vote for me. But I think we actually have to message pretty clearly, We don't understand the social determinants of safety. There's not a science for that. And I'll dig in a little bit onto what John was saying at the last piece, because I think it's really important to understand on the cost benefit analysis. The entire field of economics and political science and sociology, psychology doesn't even count, that has studied crime, that has studied criminology per se, has been studying the preponderance of violence and been studying crime stats and has almost nothing useful to say about race. And the way that I know is that as someone who has dallied in the field and invited a number of the leading scholars, the people who've won the Stockholm Prize in criminology, to come and speak on their research and how it has to do with race, when almost all of them say, I have nothing serious to say about race, that's a huge indictment of the entire academic field. And I say that to say, we know too little because we have invested too little. What we can say, though, is from a theoretical framework, we understand these problems exist on multiple levels. There's the situational, there's interpersonally, between an officer and a resident. There's institutionally, so within a city, between a police department or a department of public safety and the community. And there's structural. And most of the ways that we go about measuring things happen at the situational level, and a little bit at the institutional level, and almost nothing structurally. Which means if the problem is structural, which, hi, I study racism, it's structural, then we have almost no quantitative evidence that speaks directly to that. We've not even begun developing the language. This is why we hear so much about reimagining public safety, because it's a failure of the imagination that's come before that says, oh, well, if crime goes up, the only thing we can do is policing. It's only when crime is at its absolute lowest that we can get rid of police. No, that's actually not the case, because the root causes of crime we're not policing. It's not like there's whole communities have been sitting around waiting to crime, right, for police to just disappear. What's happening is the social determinants of safety, lack of secure income, lack of secure housing, right? Not sure where you get green vegetables, not sure where you can get a job, the lack of healthcare, the educational systems, all those sets of things. When we defund those, an interesting word to use, it turns out that you end up with more violence. So if we're seeing a spike, how long will it take for us to focus on the root causes? And the hard thing, as John talks about in the article and has talked about elsewhere, and as we've been saying for a minute, the hard thing is the structural things take some time. We have a crisis right now where Black and brown bodies are dropping in their own communities. And what do we do to bridge the gap between the time it takes for the structural fixes to take effect and right now? Because we can't just abandon that time to principle and values.
Yeah. Let me follow up by asking you about cops, because I know from our previous conversation that you talk to cops, commanders, and beat officers. And we read in the media that, they're demoralized and, and all of this after the last year's protest. Is that true in your experience, or what is the real more complex picture that we're not getting from the media about cops?
Yeah, so it's absolutely true, and it shouldn't be difficult for us to fathom. Their job is to go out and respond to community members who are reporting that they're either uncomfortable or unsafe. And when they show up, a preponderance of members of that community say they shouldn't have their jobs or they do them terribly every day. Right. Now, I'm a professor, so I get told I'm terrible at my job every day, and that can be demoralizing, right? Tenure is good for such things. But when you are your job is literally put yourself between danger and other things, or at least you imagine that's what your job is, that's incredibly demoralizing. I think the more complex version of this, though, is that police are not all one color, even though we talk about them as blue. Blue is not a race. You don't grow up blue. Even the Smurfs weren't really blue at the beginning. The reality is that Black officers are going home to communities that are saying this about them, and they believe many of the same things. And then they show up to law enforcement that is increasingly, inundated with images that are associated with white supremacy and that are directly white supremacist. So how much harder is it to be a Black or brown officer showing up for that gig, fighting against these sort of images and the earned reputation of your chosen profession and the people who refuse to acknowledge it? So right now there are sort of coalitions, collaborations of Black, Latinx, Asian, Native law enforcement coming together and saying, we need to take the lead in this profession if it's ever going to be anything like legitimate. And they are starting, for many of them, to see for the first time, oh, it's deeper than we thought. It's worse than we thought. And the road to get from here to what we imagined we were signing up for is further than we thought. So when we hear about the demoralization happening within law enforcement, it's as if it's the profession. And I wish we would drill down to the folks who are feeling it by far the worst, which are those who are not white in that profession.
Yeah, interesting. Amy Fettig. The Sentencing Project exists basically to fight extreme incarceration. Can you tell us, like, what's going on in incarceration and sentencing in America right now? With the crime spike, has sentencing gotten harsher as well?
Well, sentencing in America, in the age of mass incarceration, the last 40 years, has never not been harsh.
Yeah.
I want to make that very, very clear, that even the relatively modest reforms that we've seen in the criminal legal space over the last 10, 15 years, really not touched seriously on the deep end of incarceration and on the extremity of our sentences. And just to give you a flavor, we now have more people serving life in prison in this country than we had in all of our prisons in 1970. We have over 200,000 people serving a life sentence. That's unprecedented. So when we're talking about solving mass incarceration, it's not just the number of people we bring in, it's the length of time that they stay in prison, which we know from data and research that spans decades is way longer than it needs to be. And John mentions this in his article about the fact that the extremity of punishment does not deter crime. Someone who commits gun violence is not thinking, oh my goodness, I might get a 25-year enhancement on my sentence. That does not deter people. So length of sentence actually doesn't make a lot of sense from a public safety point of view, because frankly, people age out of crime. And in America right now, the fastest growing population, because of the age of extreme sentencing and excessive punishment, the fastest growing population is 55 and over. Historically, it's always been those 18 to 24-year-olds, which we somewhat intuitively know are the folks who generally commit crime. But now in America, we have grandpa and grandma behind bars. And that doesn't make a lot of sense from a public safety point of view. It doesn't make a lot of sense from a humane point of view, as we've seen in COVID-19, where people have died, fragile people inside prison have died at much higher rates. But it also doesn't make sense from a fiscal point of view. We're spending billions of dollars to put people away for decades and even a lifetime. It costs a fortune, and we could be using those scarce resources on the violence interruption and prevention that would actually be changing this conversation that we're having today. Because this is the same conversation that we had in 2001. It's the same conversation that we had in the 90s. It's the same conversation we've had in the 80s. What are we going to do about the violent crime spike? And we've always had the same solution: police, prosecutors, and prisons. And it simply doesn't work as a one size fits all. Now, John, I'm probably one of those progressive criminal justice folks that are accused of trying to ignore the violent crime spike. And I'm going to say that's not the case at all. Because myself, my colleagues, my community wants safety, and we want violence prevention as much as anybody else. We're going to look at the data. There has been a spike. But what we should want to say now is, why are we trying to rely on the same one-size-fits-all solution that we've done for the last 40 years that hasn't actually led to a change? Unfortunately, in the last few years, we actually have some better ideas about violence interruption and prevention, programs that have flourished even in the last 3 years, and that we can invest in instead of simply ratcheting up how many people we send to prison and how long we send them there. Community investment in kids. And frankly, we've got a chance right now. With the American Rescue Plan, there are more dollars in our communities, especially at the county level, than there has been in over a generation. And there's an opportunity to actually make smart investments. For example, school districts now have a lot more funds. Instead of investing in school resource officers and sending kids to prison, and we know that those will primarily be children of color, let's invest in mental health and supports for those kids who we know are going to be stressed and traumatized after spending a year and a half in lockdown in an unprecedented, historically awful experience. So we do have an opportunity to do something better. I know I thought John's article was terrific. It brought forward the data. It brought forward what's really happening, the fear mongering, the race baiting that is really leading us potentially down the same broken path we have tread for decades. But I also think we've got an opportunity to do something different. We do have the defund the police movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the racial reckoning that is still ongoing in this country, where 10 years ago, we weren't talking about progressive prosecutors or defund the police. Is that alone going to solve the problem that we're in? No, but we have an opportunity to try different things and to break free from this mold that, frankly, it hasn't gotten us anywhere, and it certainly has not prevented violence in the way that we all want.
Yeah. You mentioned just a couple of minutes ago that there are some local programs that show some promise. Can you give people a sense of a couple of those?
Yes. I mean, John actually mentions a few that have been pretty successful in various jurisdictions. In my own home city in DC, for example, we're investing in violence prevention in hospitals. People who come into hospitals who have gunshot wounds, give them some support so they don't go back out into the community and retaliate. Try to prevent violence where it's happening. At the same token, in Chicago schools, we're seeing great violence prevention programs with kids. That's a wonderful place to invest with children, to give them a different lens in which to see the world. Likewise, block by block in DC, where we're investing in communities looking at the relatively few people who actually commit gun violence, but the structural problems that underlie that, and going to block by block to invest in those communities, not in police, but in actual social safety supports. Because so much of what we've seen in our communities is a lack of investment, whether it's education or jobs or housing, and that has been exacerbated during the COVID pandemic. And people are afraid. So give them something to hope for rather than to constantly be afraid of the next day is going to be privation. It's not surprising that we're seeing this violence spike, I think, by any means. What will be surprising is if we look to old solutions for something that has been an unprecedented historical movement.
Yeah. John, Amy's talking about a cycle of reaction, of public reaction to some extent, but also reaction among conservative politicians, Republican politicians that always force the conversation in a certain direction, and liberals and progressives, have responses, but they don't seem to win the day in the court of public opinion. Am I right or wrong about that? And if I'm right about it, what can change that?
So yes and no, because the word public doesn't have much meaning here, right? Because it's publics with an S, right? Because one thing that defines the American criminal justice system is how completely disaggregated it is, right? Police respond to a mayor, the DA is elected by the county, sentencing rules and prisons are run by the state. No one is properly aligned with anyone else. They're all dealing with each other and they all have different incentives, right? And so, for example, I think one of the most striking features of Larry Krasner's recent reelection, Democratic primary win, which will inevitably become his reelection in Philadelphia for the DA, is that he was running against someone sort of handpicked by the police department as a tough on crime guy. And Larry Krasner handily won all the districts with the highest levels of shooting. Right? The people who are most exposed to violence rejected the Philadelphia Police Department's candidate and chose a person who is quite adversarial to the police department, right? Because they understand those trade-offs, because they live those trade-offs every single day of their lives, right? At the same time, we're seeing red states, the state legislature, very much the state legislature, not the local ones, passing laws to gut blue city laws, right? So Texas has made it impossible to cut police budgets. Arizona just passed a law requiring that any local police oversight board must be staffed 100% with active duty police officers. That's the entire civilian oversight board, is just the police, right? Because that's a different public, right? State publics are much more conservative than city publics that tend to be much bluer, right? And so city or county officials face a different public and they do better at the state level, with preemption being a really dangerous thing in red states, because there's nothing blue states can shield themselves from a federal intervention because the Constitution steps in to sort of block federal harassment of states to some degree. But cities are entirely the legal creation of states. And so state legislatures are free to tell cities what to do, whatever they want them to do. That's how you see them banning mask rules and other sort of distancing laws, because they can, right? And so in red states, you're seeing this, right? And so this idea that what is the public? Well, there's lots of different publics, right? And city publics are taking a much different view than sort of the state publics. And so city officials have a lot more flexibility to do things as long as the states don't step in to stop them than perhaps state officials can, right? And so I think reformers are doing successful at the local level, where crime isn't some sort of abstract concept, right, to sort of reflect some sort of deeper social value. It's literally you're walking out your door and you're afraid you're going to get, there's a risk of being harmed by someone attacking you, there's a risk of being harmed by the police officer, and you feel that tension every day, right? And so there are successes and there are failures, because it's not sort of homogenous polity that's making these kinds of calls. How do you push to the state level? That's hard. I mean, we even saw this in New York State, right? We have a blue governor, sort of. I mean, I think he has national aspirations and he's kind of triangulating some weird way, hoping he might someday win Mississippi to become president. But, he used COVID to gut bail reform, right? He, at the height of New York City's surge in the first round of COVID, as we wait for the second one to come, he threatened to shut down the entire state government, including the Department of Health, if the Democratic legislature didn't roll back some parts of the bail reform law that the police kept saying were causing crimes that the evidence made very clear they actually weren't causing, right? And faced between sort of standing up to the mayor at the peak of the crisis or rolling back the reforms, they rolled back the reforms, right? And so at the state level, I don't have a good answer. How do you push back against this? I think at the local level, we are seeing successes and durable successes. I mean, Amy said, 10 years ago, we weren't talking about progressive this and that. 5 years ago, right? Like Larry Krasner and Kim Ogg, they're the first progressive DAs to win re-election because they're the first progressive DAs to come up for re-election, right? The term didn't even exist 6 years ago. You had Kim Fox, Kim Ogg, who's sort of fallen from progressive grace these days. In 5 years ago, you had Larry Krasner 4 years ago. Like, it's a remarkably new movement, and the extent to which it dominates the conversation now, right? 5 years ago, the term progressive prosecutor didn't exist. Now we're using everything we can to try to undermine this movement, because I think it struck genuine fear into conservative heart, sort of tough on crime. Be very clear about the distinction there. Sort of tough on crime views. There are tough on crime Democrats and reformist Republicans out there for sure. And so I think the future is very hard to predict, right? Because we have changed rapidly. The dialogue and conversation has shifted in profound ways in just 5 or 6 years. It could all be a flash in the pan and collapse under the weight of this homicide spike. That is very much something that keeps me awake, that and kids who don't go to bed on time. But it's also quite possible that the change we have seen is something very real, and that the politics of 5 years from now are incredibly hard to predict in the way that are much easier to sort of see, in the early 90s or something, when it was a minor change. This is something where potentially, though not by no means guaranteed to be a seismic shift.
Yeah. Phillip, do you agree largely with what John just said about these seismic changes of the last 5 years? And I'd also be very interested in hearing you weigh in on the New York mayoral outcome in this context.
Yeah, I imagine you might be. So on what John had to say, I think I'll say a thing that John didn't, but in this case, a slight disagreement. I do think that the progressive side on this has been bad. The reason why the progressive side on this wins at the local level is because people don't need to be educated; they're living it. Right? That's right. But the messaging isn't helping. You don't need to message with people who already agree with you because they're having the same shared experience. Right? States are much more imagined communities, and at the state level, progressive folks have had a harder time with it. I also think the frames that get brought to this, if I can use a terribly inapt metaphor, you're bringing a knife to a gunfight, right? You're talking about, well, we need to, like, communities need to be safe more broadly. We need to give people resources. That's what I say. I'm an academic. Don't use academic language to message on this stuff, right? Learn from your academics. Like, we're boring, so use other language. And the frame is about either sort of basic conditions or sort of being tough on people who don't deserve. There's a villain in the language that's coming from the political right. There's no villain in the language from the left. Villain language is easier, it's motivating, and it's hard to do battle against it if you don't then strike down, actually, there's no villain here. So I'm convinced that the language of the Alliance for Safety and Justice has been using for a while. If we're going to talk about criminal justice and not just criminal legal systems, then it should be justice for the people who are harmed by crime. And when you ask the people who are harmed by crime what they want, it's not more punishment, because they're harmed by their neighbors. That lands a little bit different than the way that folks on the political left have been messaging about this stuff. And it's part of the reason why we end up losing, is because if you use the same metaphors as the people against you, that are fighting against you, you're going to lose the argument. So yeah, I think that the progressive wing of this stuff, the reform or frankly the abolitionist wing of this stuff, that the messaging is not great. And so the people who don't already agree, who are not sharing the experience, aren't there. I think what gives me some optimism in this space is more and more people are having contact. That's not a good thing, but it does allow for message clarity, right? And so what's happening is that more and more of the folks who have had this kind of contact, folks who have broken ribs and have difficult times going home because of their contact with the criminal legal system, are sharing and messaging. So I think it's okay that we're in an incubator period in terms of messaging. I think that's fine. I'm seeing in some of the questions here that people are saying, oh, we have to reject the language of defund. We have to reject the language. It hasn't been said here, but it'll come up. We have to reject the language of abolition. But not everything's for you. Right? This is language that's being incubated by people who are directly experiencing it oftentimes, right? As being trial ballooned out in the national conversation. And if 1 out of every 100 folks gets connected to it, that's cool. That's the same number of folks who we've got incarcerated. Yeah. So it may be the case that we're moving the needle because on a national level, less policing is now mainstreamed. Less across the board is now mainstream. It's a central plank of abolition as an intellectual tradition, and as I said, illicit demands, and that's now mainstream. And more people who are going to show up, like the NRA, which is actually 5 people real angry on a Wednesday, right? But they show up to absolutely everything. More and more people who are going to show up to absolutely everything have some shared language, and I think that's good, even if it is not sophisticated or targeted at moving the center. It's targeted at galvanizing the set of folks who are engaged all day, every day. So I think we haven't been good, and I think maybe that's not the worst thing in the world, because we're not set up to win from an infrastructure position. Like, it's going to be generations before we're there, and it's certainly going to be the rest of my lifetime before we see certain things. I do think that we're in a moment that I am increasingly optimistic we're not going to retreat from, because some things that have been central. I mean, the most important central thing is less. We've been talking about less from an incarceration standpoint for a long time. And finally, public safety gets to be part of the conversation we're having on criminal legal issues. And less gets to be part of the same messaging all the way through. And this is the part that I'll leave with. So John talked about, Amy said we weren't talking about this 10 years ago. John said, what about 5 years ago? How about last year? Because as of last year, to the best of the information we've got, policing in this ecosystem of nonprofits, the ecosystem of activists, got about 2.5% of all of the money that went to criminal legal systems. 2.5%. That's a 20-to-1 issue or worse. You cannot show me the community in the United States that experiences the pain of policing to the pain of incarceration as a 20-to-1 issue, but we've been funding it that way. We've been talking about it that way. And up until last year, we were talking about policing and criminal justice as if they could ever be separate. And finally, law enforcement gets to show up to the party. Public safety gets to show up to the party. And that says to me that we've got enough coherence in the way that we're thinking about race and punishment and the gut-wrenching pain that we've been giving to the folks who refer to themselves, folks I deal with, as throwaway people. We're getting enough coherence that maybe it can last past the pendulum swinging back in the other direction, particularly on this one issue, this one theme. Less, please.
Yeah. Yeah, speaking of less, Amy, as Phil just said, we have been talking about less incarceration. So there's this bill supposedly working its way through Congress, supposedly, and it looks okay to me, from what I've read about it. If they pass what they have, from what you know of it, will it help? Will it do any good?
So What we generally see from Congress, especially in a Congress that is intent on always doing a bipartisan, and in criminal justice context and reform context, it's hard to get anything done if it's not bipartisan. So what we're looking at right now, and it just is one bill, there are a host of what I would call incremental but important reforms. So you've got the First Step Implementation Act, the COVID-19 Safer Detention Act, the Equal Act. All of these allow for resentencing, for lowering the incarceration population. And from my perspective, with the First Step Implementation Act and the COVID-19 Safer Detention Act, they create mechanisms where we allow folks, people who frankly, even people who have been sentenced to life without parole, to get a second look before a judge. Folks who have spent decades in prison and had no previous hope of going home, or not in a very, very long time, Congress is actually taking a serious look for the first time to say, look, the sentencing of the past of mass incarceration was excessive. For many who will vote for it, there's also a recognition that it was racially based, and that race pervades our entire system and is a huge reason why we have the largest incarceration system, if not the primary one. And I would argue, and many would argue, that our system of mass incarceration is premised on racism. So we do see some hope coming out of Congress. Those two bills that I mentioned are supposed to go up in October for a hearing. I'm hopeful that we will see some movement, but is it going to be enough? Absolutely not. I think Phillip is right that we are seeing green shoots of change here. The dialogue has changed even since last year with the murder of George Floyd. There is now more space for talking about different solutions than there has ever been before. Even the fact that defund the police has actually become a mainstream talking point, even though it's often used in a racist and retrograde manner, the fact that it is a conversation in this country is incredibly important. So it does give me hope that sort of appetite for change and that idea of difference and leadership can actually filter up to Congress. Will it take a while? Yes, I agree with Phillip and John that this is a long-term effort. The important thing is that we keep at it and that we focus on a vision of something that is so different than what we have today, that it does give that road back to the people who will come behind us. I definitely don't see abolition in my lifetime, but I am not worried about working on a greater good that I will not live to see. And I think that many people feel that way. And of course, in America, in the context of racial justice and reform and achieving criminal justice, you have to have a long-term vision, because otherwise you actually are never going to achieve any kind of substantive change.
Let me go to some audience questions here with just 15 minutes left. Here is a question for Amy. So Amy, don't mute yourself. From Annalise, and Amy says, as the leader of one of the major criminal justice reform advocacy organizations, what single policy reform would you say is achievable by this Congress?
Single policy reform. I think this Congress will pass the First Step Implementation Act. I also think that they're going to pass the COVID-19 Safer Detention Act, so that we will see, and remember
Tell
that
people a little bit about what those do. Yeah.
Okay. Well, the First Step Implementation Act and the COVID-19 Safer Detention Act, as I said, they are expected to go to the Senate floor in October. So this is a really good opportunity for a little bit of change. And remember that the First Step Act was passed during the Trump presidency. So there is a possibility of, there's a little bit of bipartisan ownership of those issues. But both bills really have provisions that allow people who have had extreme sentences the opportunity to petition a judge for a sentencing reduction. So this is an individual determination, but like the First Step Implementation Act, we're talking about over 1,000 people. For the COVID-19 Safer Detention Act, we are talking about a smaller group of individuals, but those who are the most aged in the system, who have served over 30 years without a possibility of parole, who will now be able to come before a judge and say, look, I'm 70 years old. I have done X, Y, and Z while in prison. I am no longer a threat to public safety. So this is important for the federal prison system. I also think it is important as a signal to the states, who have many more people who are sentenced under these extreme regimes, who are elderly, that they need to change their excessive punishment and that it is safe to do so. I mean, we know empirically that it's a good public safety measure. It's smart, it's humane, it's fiscally sound. But unfortunately, there is we don't have a plethora of leadership at the state level that we need to be forward thinking. And so having Congress demonstrate to the various state systems that they can change the way they've envisioned sentencing and frankly make up for some of the mistakes of the past, of which there are many in the criminal justice system.
I could just add one quick point to sort of build off what Amy said. I think the one thing to appreciate about the states, though, as opposed to the feds, is that the Fed prison population is about 49% drugs, and most of the long-serving sentences are drugs. The state system overall, and the states hold about 88% of all prisoners, right? The feds are about 12% of all prisons, about 1% of all arrests. The states are 88% of all prisoners. Over half of all people in prison are there for violence. We have as many people in prison today just for homicide. 1/8 of all people in prison are there for murder. 1/4 are in for murder or rape. If you look at people who are serving the long sentences, 90-some% are in for serious violence, 10 years or more, over half are in just for murder. And Amy is exactly right, that we can let many of these people out at no public safety risk whatsoever. But at the state level, unlike the federal level, what we need, and this is why the leadership is so hard to find, is we need politicians willing to embrace the idea that we have to have second looks and bigger parole and shorter sentences, primarily for homicide, armed robbery, and rape. And from a public safety point of view, we can, but the morality and the politics of that are radically different at the state level than at the federal level. And we are slowly, painfully slowly seeing the conversation shift on violence. It is not easy to change that conversation. It is brutal and hard. It is shifting, but it's going to be a lot longer at the state level than the feds, just because of who are serving those long sentences in the state level are the most politically untouchable category of people in prison compared to what the feds look like.
Yeah, and if I could just build on what John said, I'm very aware of that. That is absolutely true. And it goes to something that Phillip mentioned, and a shift that I'm seeing in my own practice, and that's the recognition of a difference within the victims and survivors community, where increasingly we are seeing survivors, and these are survivors of violent crime or family members of people who were murdered, speaking out and saying we need a different solution than just extreme sentences and just prisons and police to the problem of violence in our society. The survivors community is not a uniform community. Oftentimes, who we see get carted out is the white woman. We do not see the vast majority of victims of crimes, frankly. But increasingly, we are seeing leadership, especially from communities of color, saying, look, we need a different way of dealing with this. We understand that the people who commit violent crimes were victims of violent crimes 9 out of 10 times. They are traumatized. They were the victims who didn't get services. And so we need to break this chain, this never-ending iteration of a victim and a survivor and perpetrator. What we're doing doesn't work. And so foregrounding the fact that survivors and community members have different solutions and perhaps better solutions to the violence that we see in our society. And of course, never forgetting that when we're talking about homicide rates in this country, we're talking about gun violence. It is about guns. What's the difference between the US and Canada and the US and the UK and France and Germany, all the other countries in the world that have experienced the pandemic and haven't had an uptick in homicides? They don't have guns everywhere on their streets. And so we need to hold politicians accountable who are using race baiting, things like talking about, oh, defund the police is the problem. Black Lives Matter is the problem. It's the same thing that they said in the 1980s and 90s. Oh, we need to be tough on crime. It's always coded language for racism. using this race baiting instead of actually addressing the real problem, which is that it is easier to get a gun in this country than it is to get a driver's license. The legal and illegal guns that are readily available, and it's easy to kill people with a gun. It's easy to kill a lot of people with a gun. 6-year-olds do not get murdered on in their front yards by stray knives. Let's get serious about one of the things that has been untouchable in this country when we're talking about criminal justice reform and quite frankly, manufacturing reform. Guns are everywhere. They're too easy, and the gun lobby is too powerful.
I'm into that. Philip, I'm going to come back to you on this topic because David has a question that mentions Eric Adams. Does Eric Adams's victory indicate a way to bridge the gap between current homicide spike and the political impact thereof and longer run solutions? I guess he's asking, does Adams portend some kind of solution?
No.
Okay.
Probably you want me to have more words, but that'd be my answer is no.
Yeah.
I think that it is, it's all too common, especially when we're talking about criminal legal issues, to look at New York and think that it matters. Outside of New York, it does not.
Yeah.
It often just doesn't. New York City is a weird place. It's in a state which is weird because it contains New York City. A state that had Syracuse and Buffalo and Albany would be a perfectly reasonable state any place else, but it has New York City as if it's only one city. And the democratic politics of New York City are just bananas compared to any other place. It's different than and even more outlandishly unconnected to what a national trend would look like than even Los Angeles, Chicago, or Houston, and by a mile. So all I'm saying is that we should not overgeneralize what's happening in New York City to any other place, despite the fact that many people who are deeply invested in this, in part because of the deep connections to New York, and I used to live there, they want to make New York City into a thing. It's not a thing. It's not going to be a harbinger of other stuff. That said, I do think that there is a debate that's going on right now about is there a sort of common sense middle that the political left should be occupying around criminal legal issues. And I've heard from a number of politicians who are struggling to sort of be responsive to Black communities that are saying, hey, this violence thing is real and we're hurting. And also be responsive to Black activists who are saying, if you think about giving even one more penny to law enforcement or this criminal legal system, then we will protest every day, every second outside of your house. I gotta say, I'm not super concerned about that because I think that's exactly the thing that should be happening. It's exactly the set of forces, exactly that loudly, that the political left and frankly, political center and political right should have been dealing with for generations. Mm-hmm. There's been violence in Black and brown communities, and we've been funding punishment instead of prevention. How the heck does that sound? We've been crafting narratives about how people make bad choices when we've been ignoring the fact we've only ever given them terrible options. Right. And then when the communities cry out, we only selectively hear, as Bachelor Weaver and Elizabeth Hinton like to say, we selectively hear the cries to be responsive to the violence with solutions to the immediate crisis. And we don't hear, please don't grow this system that seems like it's targeted only at us, only because it is. So I want this to be difficult for the political left. And I hope that there's some messaging out of it that doesn't suck, because the political left's messaging on these issues has just simply been, that's not that important. We're not really good at it. And we kind of think what anybody who's brown thinks, or not, or maybe it's the middle if we're in a county where guns are kind of important, right? There's not been serious engagement on this from anything that I would consider political left establishment.
So what is better messaging? How does better messaging, what does it start with?
So I am not a messaging person.
Right.
But I'd say I don't suck at it nearly as hard as the political left does, and in this particular space. So I'll say that forget about messaging, let's talk about values. And we've got four at the Center for Policing Equity that drive us in this moment, not just generally, but in this moment. And the first is nobody feels safer when they have to call out for help. No real estate agent has ever said, and the best part about this house, you get to call 911 all the time. That's not a thing. Right? Like that's a sketch on Saturday Night Live, and it's a bad one. So that means we need to give communities the resources they need so they can take care of their own problems and don't need to be calling out in crisis. That's one. Two, when there is a crisis, we better send the tools and the solutions that are appropriate for that crisis. Which means if my crisis is homelessness, why are you sending a badge and a gun? That doesn't help me. If my crisis, I'm worried about my mental health and I'm thinking about ending my life, a badge and a gun never made that better. Right? So we know that there are a number of crises where law enforcement is almost always the first set of responses. Send the right tools for the job. The third, which I should maybe say is the first, white supremacy is bad. And there's a lot of systems here that we have built up that were created with the explicit goal of furthering white supremacy, and we have never interrupted from that creation. We should probably look at that. The fourth for us, which is the hardest to message, it's the hardest one to actually realize, which means it's the most important. The things we do to change the systems that we have should not impede the creation of the systems that we need. Okay? That means sometimes you got to reduce the harm. Works in public health, got to work in public safety too. Sometimes you got to make our addiction to punishment less. But the things that we do to do that should never impede a world that looks like the world we want it to look like. And so often nonprofits, activists, politicians are trying to do the right now so hard, they forget what comes later. They forget to even think about it. You set those sets of things up, those actually turn out to be decent messages. Turns out they poll pretty okay with centrists and political right and activists who self-label as abolitionists. And I'm not saying that you can be kumbaya in this, but I do think that if you are required for the sake of your job to be responsive to people who are worried about murder and responsive to people who are worried about generational white supremacy, I think we come up with better messaging than what I find on the political left in the United States. So I welcome the fact that it's hard right now.
We just have a couple minutes, so let's go first to Amy and then to John, just with some concluding thoughts, the thoughts you want the people who are tuned in here to carry home. Let us assume that this, a couple months ago, it looked like we were going to turn the corner on COVID. Now we're not so sure, but eventually we're going to. Maybe to the extent this is COVID driven, the homicide rates will recede and crime will recede a bit. What do we need to have learned from this? What do we need to do coming out of it?
Well, I think we need to take this as a moment of both challenge and opportunity, because we have been to some extent jarred out of our complacency, unfortunately by a previously unimaginable human tragedy. But that means that we have to take those lessons and that opportunity to do something very, very different than we did before, to imagine things differently. Are we facing a crime spike, and have we faced them before? Absolutely. But this is a unique moment in our history where people are more awake than they have been before to the underlying white supremacy and racial injustice that has allowed us to create such an abominable criminal justice system, criminal legal system. And so we need to take that awareness and build towards something better. And I think we absolutely can. We've talked about the progressive prosecutors. We've talked about violence prevention and that focus, where we have new tools and better tools, and a very explicit questioning of why we always rely on police to solve so many of our social problems. And I would say that even further than that, it's not just police, it is the entire criminal legal system that we have substituted as our social safety system. And it's a disaster. 40 years of a disaster is enough. So I'd say, take heart. The forces are aligning against us because we have made progress. So now is the time to push back even harder and demand real change, real reform, and an end to the use of race and frankly, crime as the proxy for race, and to end the hiding behind crime when you're really just a racist.
Thank you. And John, last word.
So I want to end kind of where Phil ended with his point about what we do today, make sure it doesn't impede what we want to do tomorrow, right? Because I see that as one of the big rhetorical pushes those on the tough on crime side are making effectively, if incorrectly, right now is, okay, fine, I get all your long-term fix the root causes problem, you hippie, but I need a cop on the corner today to stop this murder today, right? That's very much Jim Foreman's point, his Pulitzer Prize winning Locking Up Our Own, right? That Black DC councilpeople were incredibly tough on crime because they needed the guy with the gun off the corner today, so you could then invest in the schools and the food stores and the hospitals for tomorrow. But here's the catch. One, you don't get police today, right? What does expanding police mean? It means in 6 months, you have a bigger cadet class that then rolls out 6 months after that. And in a year, you have a rookie cop hitting the street to do whatever rookie cops do when they hit the street, right? It's not, we can't actually ramp up policing today because you have to train them to be a police officer today. So either going to cannibalize other cities, right? Or you got to spend in what is going to take a year or 6 months to get these forces bigger. At the same time, there's evidence that Medicaid expansion in its first year cut crime by like 13 or 14 billion dollars, right? Through drug treatment, non-drug court drug treatment. People stop using drugs and they stop beating people up, domestic violence, robbery, theft, right? And so I think Phil, one point Phil made is incredibly important about the overselling of things is right, we can't scale up violence interrupters to the same scope of policing departments by tomorrow, right? We spend $100 billion a year on police nationwide. We probably spend a couple of $1 million on cure violence and these kinds of programs. You're not gonna ramp it up to a $100 billion program by next month. But Medicaid and Medicare, they're huge programs that can scale up, and Medicaid expansion works. You know what else reduces crime? Streetlights, right? Brighter corners reduce crime. Departments of Transportation already have billions of dollars, right? We can think carefully about things on the ground today that we can scale up today that reduce crime today that aren't necessarily the policing, right? And then when we do have to scale up policing, we should think about how to do that in a way that makes it easier to scale it back tomorrow, right? So overtime. I'm actually very, very pro overtime for policing right now because overtime gives more money to cops today, but doesn't hire a new officer. And in fact, it encourages retirement. One reason why the NYPD is seeing massive retirements, the unions claim it's depressed. No. Your pension is your last year's salary. And they have worked so much overtime with the protests, they're all out because they're all retiring at money they will never see again. And then look at their second job to double that again, right? And so overtime is great because you don't hire that new cop who's going to lobby his union to keep his job for the next 40 years. And you encourage the old guys to retire as soon as the crisis is passed, right? And so while I see abolitionists say overtime is bad, yes, in general, it's more money, but it's actually the money we can cut in a way you can't cut the new cop, right? Shot spotter, right? We'll invest in surveillance tech because it's cheap. Yes, it's cheap and it never goes away, right? Once that camera's up there and that microphone's up there, we're never going to take it down, right? So maybe we don't invest in the cheap stuff today because it's going to stay cheap tomorrow. And we should think about where we want our money to actually go, right? And so I think that's the huge point is that one, Phil's exactly right, that so many of the programs we like, cognitive behavioral therapy, violence interruption, these things all have some moderate confusing evidence. They haven't really been tested all that great. But you also can't scale them up by Thursday, right? But Medicaid expansion, you can. Department of Transportation improvements, you can. Department of Public Housing improvements, you can. They have the infrastructure. We should think about that and about ways like address the police with the mind towards, okay, what's going to be easiest to scale back in 4 or 5 years? And there's a lot we can do. And I think it's important to think of it carefully in those kinds of terms.
Yeah. Fascinating. Amy Fettig, Phillip, Atiba, Goff, John Pfaff. We're really deeply grateful to all of you for this really interesting hour, this really interesting conversation. Follow them on Twitter, follow the New Republic on Twitter, come to TNR.com. I'm Michael Tomasky. Thank you everyone for tuning in and good night.